They gave this bear cub one bite, then he wanted the whole dang pot. The early morning light filtered through the kitchen windows of the small cabin nestled in the Smoky Mountains of North Carolina. Most homes would begin their day with the hum of a coffee machine, but the Mayfield household awakened to a symphony of wild sounds. Sleepy snorts, heavy footsteps thumping across wooden floors, and the enthusiastic clatter of a large metal bowl being rummaged through by an unexpected family member. "Bruno, that's not your breakfast yet," Linda Mayfield called out, her voice more amused than scolding. The young black bear paused, his muzzle already sticky with honey he'd managed to find, and looked at her with eyes that somehow expressed both guilt and defiance. Walter Mayfield shuffled into the kitchen, his weathered slippers dragging across the floor. At 72, his movements had slowed, but his eyes remained bright with the same curiosity that had defined his life as a former park ranger. "The little foodie is at it again," he chuckled, running a hand through his thinning white hair. "Can't blame him though. Your cooking would make anyone impatient." Linda, silver-haired and graceful at 69, placed a cup of coffee in front of her husband before turning back to prepare Bruno's actual breakfast, a hearty mixture of honey, oats, raw salmon, and steamed pumpkin. The bear watched her every move with rapt attention, occasionally rising on his hind legs to get a better view. "You know, most people our age just get a cat," Linda remarked, not for the first time. It had become something of a morning ritual, this gentle reminder of how unusual their retirement had turned out to be. Walter's eyes crinkled at the corners as he watched Bruno eagerly devour his breakfast. "Cats are fine, but they don't appreciate my fishing stories like Bruno does." The path to this warm domestic scene had begun in pain and fear, a stark contrast to the comfort that now surrounded them. 2 years earlier, Walter had embarked on what he called his last great adventure, a deep camping trip into the heart of Pisgah National Forest. Despite Linda's concerns about him going alone, he had insisted he needed one more journey into the wilderness before his knees gave out completely. On the third night, as gentle rain pattered against his tent, Walter heard it. A faint whimpering that didn't belong to any of the forest's usual nocturnal sounds. At first, he thought he was imagining things, but the sound persisted, pulling him from his sleeping bag and out into the damp darkness. With nothing but a flashlight and decades of experience in these woods, Walter followed the sound to a cold crevice between two massive boulders. The beam of light revealed a tiny, trembling form, a bear cub no more than a few months old, with its front paw caught in a steel snare. The trap wasn't one set by forest services, it was crude and illegal, likely set by poachers. The mother was nowhere to be found. Walter knew that she would never have left her cub voluntarily, which meant something had happened to her. The thought sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the night air. "Hey there, little fella," Walter whispered, keeping his voice low and calm despite the panic rising in his chest. The cub was severely injured, its paw mangled by the trap's metal teeth, and it was clear that without immediate help, the animal wouldn't survive the night. Despite his age and the arthritis that had been creeping into his joints, Walter worked methodically, using rope from his pack and a makeshift pulley system fashioned from a sturdy branch. He managed to release enough tension on the trap to free the cub's paw. The small bear was too weak from blood loss and dehydration to put up much of a fight, which worried Walter even more. He tore his spare shirt into strips, fashioning a tight bandage around the cub's wound to stop the bleeding. Then, wrapping the tiny creature in his rain jacket, he cradled it against his chest and began the arduous 3-mile trek back to where he'd parked his truck. "You hang in there now," he murmured as he navigated the difficult terrain, each step jarring his knees. "I'm not leaving you behind." The drive back to their cabin was a blur of anxiety and determination. Walter called Linda on a cell phone as soon as he had reception, his voice tight with urgency. "I need you to clear off the kitchen table and find that first aid kit from when you worked at the clinic," he told her. "And call Dr. Thompson if you can reach him. Tell him I've got a bear cub." Linda, who had spent 30 years as a veterinary nurse before retirement, didn't waste time asking questions. By the time Walter's truck rumbled up the gravel driveway, she had transformed their kitchen into a makeshift veterinary clinic. The cub, whom they would later name Bruno, was barely clinging to life. His small body was burning with fever, the infection from the trap having spread rapidly. The wound itself was a horrific mess of torn flesh and exposed bone. "Oh, Walter," Linda breathed when she saw the state of the animal. Her professional demeanor cracked for just a moment before she steadied herself. "Let's get him cleaned up." Dr. Thompson wasn't available to come in person, but he connected with them via video call, guiding Linda through the process of cleaning the wound, administering antibiotics, and setting up an 4-drip of fluids. Walter held the cub still, whispering reassurances that he wasn't sure either of them believed. "He's lost a lot of blood," Linda said after they had done all they could. "And that infection is aggressive. If he makes it through the night, he might have a chance." They took turns sitting with Bruno through the dark hours, monitoring his breathing and temperature. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, during Walter's watch, the cub's breathing became so shallow that Walter feared the end had come. Sitting there under the soft yellow light of their kitchen lamp, Walter found himself whispering to the bear with a rawness he rarely allowed himself to show. "If it were years ago, I might have left you behind," he admitted, his calloused hand gently stroking the cub's head. "That's what we were taught back then. Let nature take its course. But there was something in your eyes when I found you, something that wouldn't let me walk away. Maybe it's because I'm getting old, or maybe it's because I know what it's like to be scared and alone. Either way, you're not going anywhere without a fight, you hear me?" Whether it was the antibiotics finally taking effect or the stubborn will to live that wild creatures often possess, Bruno survived the night, and the next, and the one after that. Linda managed to contact a wildlife specialist who provided them with a formula that approximated bear milk, which they fed to Bruno through a bottle. At first, he was too weak to do much more than suckle feebly, but with each passing day, his strength grew. The wound on his paw healed slowly, leaving a twisted scar that would give him a slight limp for the rest of his life. But otherwise, Bruno thrived under the Mayfield's care, and he grew fast, strong. By the time 6 months had passed, Bruno had transformed from a frail cub into a robust young bear with a voracious appetite and an uncanny ability to find trouble. "Walter," Linda's voice carried from the kitchen one afternoon. "He's broken into the pantry again." Walter hurried in to find Bruno happily devouring an entire 10-kilo jar of wildflower honey that Walter had purchased from a local beekeeper. The bear's face was completely covered in the sticky substance, and his eyes closed in apparent ecstasy. "That was for the whole winter," Walter said, trying to sound stern but failing miserably as a smile tugged at his lips. "You're going to bankrupt us with your sweet tooth, Bruno." As Bruno continued to grow, the Mayfields adapted their home to accommodate him. Walter built a sturdy enclosure off the back of the house, complete with climbing structures and a small pool. But Bruno spent most of his time inside with them, having apparently decided that he was more house pet than wild animal. There were challenges, of course. Bruno's natural curiosity often led to disaster. Like the time he became fascinated by the sound of Linda's vacuum cleaner and declared all-out war on the machine, flipping chairs and tables in his panic. Or the 4 pairs of Walter's leather boots that met their demise under Bruno's powerful jaws. But there were tender moments too, moments that cemented the unusual bond between the bear and his human family. One evening, as a summer thunderstorm raged outside, Bruno climbed onto the memorial shelf in the living room, a place where Walter kept old photographs of his parents, a Bible that had belonged to his grandfather, and a pocket watch that had been passed down through generations. The shelf collapsed under Bruno's weight, sending everything crashing to the floor. Walter rushed in at the sound, prepared to scold the bear, but stopped short at what he saw. Bruno was sitting quietly amid the wreckage, one paw gently touching a photograph of Walter's father. Something in the bear's posture seemed almost remorseful. Walter chuckled, unexpectedly moved by the scene. "It's all right, buddy," he said, tears welling in his eyes as he knelt down beside Bruno. "No real harm done. Dad would have gotten a kick out of you. You know, he always said I had a way of bringing home strays." As Bruno approached his 2nd year with the Mayfields, his size became impossible to ignore. Standing over 6 feet tall on his hind legs and weighing several hundred pounds, he was undeniably a wild animal, regardless of his gentle nature with Walter and Linda. The incident with Martha Phelps brought that reality crashing home. Martha, a relatively new neighbor who lived half a mile down the road, had taken to walking past the Mayfield property several times a week, her curiosity about the reclusive couple barely disguised as neighborly concern. On one such walk, she happened to glance over just as Bruno was lounging in the yard, enjoying the sunshine. Her scream echoed through the mountains, sending birds scattering from trees. By the time the sheriff's deputy arrived, Walter had managed to get Bruno back inside, but Martha's hysterical description of a monster bear had created enough concern for an official visit. "Now Walter," Deputy Collins said, his tone conversational but his eyes sharp as they swept the living room for signs of the animal. "Mrs. Phelps says she saw a full-grown black bear in your yard. You know anything about that?" Walter, who had known Tim Collins since the deputy was a boy fishing in the streams near the ranger station, sighed heavily. "It's just a big dog, Tim. Giant Newfoundland mix. Linda's got a soft spot for the big lugs." From the kitchen, where she was strategically blocking the door to Bruno's room, Linda called out, "Would you like some coffee, Deputy Collins? I just made a fresh pot." The deputy hesitated, clearly not entirely convinced but unwilling to accuse Walter Mayfield of outright lying. "That won't be necessary, Mrs. Mayfield. Just make sure whatever animal you've got stays properly contained. We've had reports of livestock disturbances in the area." After the deputy left, Walter and Linda sat at their kitchen table in silence, the gravity of their situation sinking in. "We can't keep him here much longer," Linda finally said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. "It's not fair to him, and it's getting too risky for us." Walter nodded, his expression grim. "I'll make some calls tomorrow. See about wildlife sanctuaries that might take him." That night, neither of them slept well. The thought of sending Bruno away felt like tearing out a piece of their hearts. But the alternative, waiting until something went wrong, until Bruno hurt someone or was hurt himself, was unthinkable. The next morning, Walter was up before dawn, his laptop open on the kitchen table as he researched options. Linda joined him, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she examined printouts of various wildlife facilities. Bruno, sensing the unusual tension, stayed close to them, occasionally nudging Walter's hand with his nose as if seeking reassurance. "This one in Tennessee looks good," Linda said, pointing to a brochure. "They specialize in bears, and they have a good reputation for humane treatment." Walter nodded, but his eyes were distant. "It says they have viewing platforms for tourists. He'd be on display." "What choice do we have?" Linda asked gently. "We always knew this day would come." Walter closed his laptop with a decisive click. "I need to think. I'm going for a walk." He spent hours roaming the forest surrounding their property, his mind churning with possibilities and regrets. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, Walter found himself on a ridge overlooking a secluded valley just a mile from their home. The land belonged to a logging company that had been trying to sell it for years, the terrain too difficult for efficient timber harvesting. Walter had hiked through it countless times during his ranger days, admiring its dense forest and the clear stream that ran through its heart. An idea began to form, wild, impractical, but tugging at him with undeniable force. When he returned home, Linda took one look at his face and knew something had changed. "What is it?" she asked. "I think I found a solution," Walter replied, his eyes bright with purpose for the first time in days. "But it's going to take everything we've got, and then some." Over the next few days, Walter and Linda poured themselves into research. They consulted with wildlife biologists, habitat specialists, and legal experts. They crunched numbers late into the night, calculating costs and logistics. The plan was audacious: purchase the valley land, create a private wildlife sanctuary specifically designed for Bruno, and transform their home into a base of operations for a small rescue biocenter focused on rehabilitating injured wildlife. "We'd need permits," Linda pointed out. "And the land alone would cost more than we have in savings." Walter nodded, undeterred. "I know, but there might be a way." He reached out to Linda's granddaughter, Sophia, a college student with a significant social media following. After hearing their story and meeting Bruno herself, Sophia created a crowdfunding campaign, complete with videos of Bruno in the Mayfields' home. The response was overwhelming. The story of the retired couple who rescued a bear cub and now sought to create a sanctuary rather than give him up resonated with people across the country. Donations poured in, from small contributions to substantial grants from wildlife conservation organizations. 3 months later, the Mayfields became the owners of 90 acres of pristine forest land. With the help of experts and volunteers, they began creating Bruno's new home, a sanctuary that would give him the freedom of the wild while keeping him safe from the dangers that had claimed his mother. Walter worked alongside men half his age, ignoring the protests of his aging body as they constructed a simple but sturdy shelter at the edge of the property. It wasn't a cage or an enclosure, but a refuge Bruno could use in harsh weather or if he ever felt threatened. The day came to introduce Bruno to his new home. Walter led him through the forest, following the path they had walked together countless times before, but continuing past their usual turning point. Bruno seemed to sense that something was different. He stayed unusually close to Walter, occasionally making soft huffing sounds as if asking questions. When they reached the clearing where the shelter stood, Walter stopped. Bruno explored cautiously, sniffing at the unfamiliar structure and the scent markers the wildlife experts had placed to establish the area as his territory. "This is your place now, buddy," Walter said, his voice rough with emotion. "You've got real trees to climb, a stream full of fish, and all the space you could want. But we're not far, you understand? Just over that ridge there." Bruno looked at him, those intelligent eyes seeming to comprehend more than anyone would believe possible from a wild animal. Then, unexpectedly, he rose on his hind legs and placed his front paws on Walter's shoulders, something he had done as a cub but had grown too large to attempt in recent months. Walter stood firm under the weight, wrapping his arms around the bear in a final embrace. "Go on now," he whispered, stepping back. "Go explore your kingdom." For a long moment, Bruno hesitated. Then, with a final look at the man who had saved his life, he turned and lumbered into the forest, disappearing among the trees. Walter stayed until sunset, watching the empty woods. Only when the first stars appeared did he make his way back home, where Linda waited on the porch. "He settled in?" she asked. Walter nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Linda took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "He won't go far." She was right. In the days and weeks that followed, they often spotted Bruno at the edges of his new territory, watching their cabin from a distance. Occasionally, he would venture closer, accepting treats from their bins before retreating back to his wild domain. Their home transformed as well. With the proper permits secured and modifications made to meet regulations, the Mayfields' cabin became a small but official wildlife rehabilitation center. Linda's veterinary experience proved invaluable as they began taking in injured animals, mostly small mammals and birds at first, but eventually expanding their capabilities. A young red fox with a broken leg became their second long-term resident, followed by a barred owl that had lost an eye in a storm. Neither could be fully released back into the wild, but they found a home in the sanctuary alongside Bruno. Life fell into a new rhythm. Walter and Linda rose with the sun each day, caring for their charges and monitoring the sanctuary. Local schools began organizing field trips to learn about wildlife conservation, with Walter giving passionate talks about respecting nature and Linda demonstrating basic animal care. Bruno thrived in his new environment. He grew stronger and more confident, establishing a territory that encompassed most of the valley. The wildlife biologists who checked on him periodically reported that he was exhibiting perfectly natural bear behaviors, from foraging to den building. Yet he never became fully wild. At least once a week, he would appear near the cabin, sometimes bringing gifts, interesting rocks or branches, which he would leave on the porch before disappearing back into the trees. As the seasons changed and winter approached, Bruno began the natural process of preparing for hibernation. He ate voraciously, building up the fat reserves that would sustain him through the cold months. Walter and Linda supplemented his foraging with extra food, ensuring he would be well prepared for his long sleep. The first snow came early that year, blanketing the mountains in white. Bruno had already chosen his hibernation site, a natural cave on the eastern slope of the valley, well protected from wind and easily defensible. Walter, now moving more slowly as his 74th birthday approached, made the trek to the den site one last time before Bruno would retreat from the world for the winter. The cold air made his lungs burn and his knees ache, but he pressed on, determined to say a proper goodbye. The bear was waiting for him, as if he had somehow known Walter would come. He sat at the entrance to his den, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Walter approached slowly, carrying a small wooden box he had crafted in his workshop. Inside was the cloth he had used to wrap Bruno on that first night, now clean but still bearing the faint stains of blood and antiseptic. Alongside it, he had placed a handwritten letter. "Hey, big guy," Walter said, settling himself on a fallen log near the den. "Brought you something to remember me by." Bruno watched him with those same intelligent eyes that had captured Walter's heart in the forest 2 years ago. "The thing is," Walter continued, his voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through bare branches, "I'm not as young as I used to be. Doctors say my heart isn't what it should be, and this old body is wearing out faster than I'd like." He placed the box at the entrance to the den, where Bruno could investigate it if he chose. "That letter there says everything I want you to know. Linda will read it to you in the spring if I'm not around to do it myself. But the gist of it is this: if one day you wake up and don't see me nearby, don't think I've left. I am still here, in the wind that rustles the forest, in the stream where you see your reflection, and in every strong step you take through the vast mountains. Because once you love, the heart never truly disappears." Bruno rose and moved toward Walter, his movements deliberate and gentle despite his massive size. He sniffed at the box, then at Walter's hand, before returning to the mouth of his den. Walter sat with him until the light began to fade, neither of them making a sound. When it was time to leave, he stood with effort, his joints stiff from the cold. "Sleep well, Bruno," he said. "I'll see you in the spring. One way or another." That winter was particularly harsh, with storms that knocked out power and closed roads throughout the region. Walter and Linda kept busy with the rehabilitation center, which had gained enough recognition to receive modest funding from state conservation programs. Walter's health deteriorated more rapidly than anyone had expected. By February, he was spending most of his time in bed, with Linda caring for him as tenderly as they had once cared for Bruno. "You need to rest," she would tell him when she found him at the window, staring out toward the valley where Bruno slept. "I'm fine," he would insist, though they both knew it wasn't true. The last snow was melting when Walter's heart finally gave out. He passed peacefully in his sleep, Linda's hand clasped in his. She found comfort in knowing that his last words the night before had been about Bruno, wondering if the bear was stirring yet, and making Linda promise to tell him all about it when he did. Spring came to the mountains, bringing with it new life and renewal. The sanctuary continued its work under Linda's guidance, with help from volunteers and occasionally Sophia, who had graduated college and now worked for a wildlife conservation organization. As the forest awakened from its winter slumber, so too did Bruno. He emerged from his den lean but healthy, his thick coat gleaming in the sunlight. Linda made the journey to his territory on the first warm day of April, carrying with her the letter Walter had written. Though her heart was heavy with grief, she found strength in the mission her husband had entrusted to her. Bruno was waiting at the edge of the clearing, as if he somehow knew she would come. He watched her approach, his head tilted slightly in a gesture that reminded her so much of Walter that tears sprang to her eyes. "Hello, old friend," she said softly. "I've come to read you something." She settled on the same fallen log where Walter had sat months before, unfolding the letter with hands that trembled only slightly. "Dear Bruno," she began, her voice growing steadier as she read, "by the time you read this, or rather, by the time Linda reads it to you, I may be gone. My body has served me well for many years, but all things must eventually return to the earth. I want you to know that saving you was one of the best decisions I ever made. Not because it was the right thing to do, though it was, but because it brought me a kind of joy I never expected to find so late in life. You taught me that family isn't always what we expect it to be. Sometimes it's a retired couple and a bear. Sometimes it's a collection of broken creatures finding wholeness together. I've lived long enough to know that endings are just part of the journey. So don't mourn me too much. Instead, live fully in this beautiful world we've made for you. Be strong. Be wild. Be exactly who you were meant to be. And remember, if one day you wake up and don't see me nearby, don't think I've left. I am still here. In the wind that rustles the forest. In the stream where you see your reflection. And in every strong step you take through the vast mountains. Because once you love, the heart never truly disappears. With all my love, Walter. Linda folded the letter carefully and looked up to find Bruno watching her, his expression unreadable but somehow solemn. Slowly, the bear moved forward until he stood directly in front of her. He sniffed at the letter, then at her hands, before settling his massive form beside the log where she sat. They remained that way for a long time, the woman and the bear, sharing a grief that transcended species. When the sun began to set, Linda rose to leave, knowing she needed to return home before darkness fell. "Goodbye for now, Bruno," she said. "I'll be back soon." Bruno watched her go, remaining at the edge of the clearing until she disappeared from view. Then, with deliberate steps, he moved to the spot where Walter had always stood when they parted, a small rise that overlooked the valley. He sat there as the stars emerged, his gaze fixed on the distant lights of the cabin where his journey had begun. In the late afternoon sunlight, the words of Walter's letter seemed to echo among the trees, a testament to a love that defied explanation and a bond that even death could not sever. In the years that followed, Linda continued the work she and Walter had begun. The sanctuary flourished, becoming a respected center for wildlife rehabilitation and education. Bruno remained its heart and soul, a living symbol of what could be accomplished through compassion and determination. And whenever someone asked why they had chosen to spend their golden years caring for wild creatures, Linda would simply smile and repeat the words Walter had written in his final letter, because sometimes saving a creature is also saving the best part of ourselves.